Hello guys, in the previous video we saw how to create an IAM user and IAM group. In this video we will discuss more about AWS IAM. In this video, first of all we will see what is IAM, then we will discuss some of the features of IAM, and at last we will discuss about IAM identities, which include root user account, IAM users, IAM user groups and IAM roles. So let's get started. First, let's see what is IAM. IAM stands for Identity and Access Management. AWS Identity and Access Management, or IAM, is a web service that helps us securely control access to AWS resources. With IAM, we can centrally manage permissions that control which AWS resources users can access. We can also use IAM to control who is authenticated and authorized to use AWS resources. Now, let's see some of the features of IAM. So, first is shared access to AWS account. We can grant other people permissions to administer and use resources in our AWS account without having to share our password or access key. We can simply create an IAM user with the required permissions, which will be having its own password and access key, and share that with other people. Second is granular permissions. We can grant different permissions to different people for different resources. For example, we might allow some users complete access to Amazon EC2, Amazon S3, and other AWS services. And for other users, we can allow read-only access to just some S3 buckets. Third is multi-factor authentication. We can add two-factor authentication to our account and to individual users for extra security. With multi-factor authentication, or MFA, we must provide not only a password or access key to work with our account, but also a code from a specially configured device, as we have already done this in our previous video where we enabled MFA for logging into our AWS account. Next is identity federation. We can allow users who already have passwords elsewhere. For example, in the corporate network or with an internet identity provider, in order to get temporary access to our AWS account. And the last one is free to use. AWS Identity and Access Management is one of the features of AWS account which is offered at no additional cost. We are charged only when we access other AWS services using IAM users or roles. Now, let's discuss about IAM identities. First, let's see what are IAM identities. An IAM identity provides access to an AWS account. An IAM identity represents a human user or programmatic workload and can be authenticated and then authorized to perform actions in AWS. Each IAM identity can be associated with one or more policies. Now you might be wondering, what are policies? So policies basically determines what actions a user, role or member of a user group can perform on which AWS resources and under what conditions. Now let's see different AWS IAM identities. First is root user account. So when we first create an AWS account, we begin with an identity that has complete access to all the AWS resources and services in the account. This identity is called the AWS root user account, and this account can be accessed by signing in with the email address and password that we use to create the AWS account. An important point to note here is that It is highly recommended by AWS that we should never use root user for our day-to-day tasks, because root user account is very powerful. It has access to do anything with all the resources and services inside our AWS account. Also, we need to keep our root user accounts credential secured and only use them to perform the tasks that only the root user can perform. Next is IAM user. An IAM user is an identity within our AWS account that has specific permissions for a single person or application. Or we can also say that it represents a person or a service that interacts with the AWS resources. For example, we can create an IAM user and give them permissions to create a S3 bucket. IAM users also have long-term credentials that they can use to create AWS using that they can use to access AWS resources using AWS Management Console or programmatically using the AWS CLI or AWS APIs. IAM users also showcase the principle of least privilege, which states that identities should only be permitted to perform the smallest set of actions necessary to fulfill a specific task. For example, if any user is required to read any data from any particular S3 bucket, then we should give read-only access for that particular S3 bucket to that user. This balances usability, efficiency, and security. Operating under the principle of least privilege helps limit the unintended access and helps track who has access to what resources. Next is IAM User Group. An IAM User Group is an identity that specifies a collection of IAM users. We can use IAM groups to specify permissions for multiple users at a time. Groups makes permissions easier to manage for large sets of users. For example, in the diagram, there are three groups: developer, security, and admins. Inside developer group, we have two users named Anna and John. And also we have a security permissions policy attached to developers group, which can be describing which actions are available for the users inside the developers group. Similarly, inside security group, we have Carlos, and inside admins group, we have Mary. We can attach different policies to security and admins group, and the most important point, we should always keep in mind the principle of least privilege while creating IAM policies. Now, let's discuss about IAM roles. IAM roles are entities that provides access to different AWS services based on the level of permissions they have, which makes them similar to AWS IAM users. Roles do not have passwords or access keys associated with them. Instead, roles provide temporary security credentials to whomever has the ability to assume that role. Roles basically eliminate the overhead of managing users and their long-lived credentials by generating temporary credentials whenever required. Now let's see the structure of an IAM role. IAM role is made up of two essential aspects: trust policy and permissions policy. Let's discuss them one by one. First is trust policy. A trust policy is a policy that defines and controls which principals can assume the role based on the specified conditions. Trust policies are also used to prevent the misuse of IAM roles by unauthorized or unintended entities. Second is permission policy. Permission policy defines what the principals who assume the role are allowed to do once they assume it. Now let's see what is an IAM policy and how it looks. An IAM policy is a JSON document that consists of one or more statements. There are various elements that make up an IAM policy statement. First is effect. The effect can be allow or deny. By default, all the requests are denied and we have to explicitly mention in order to allow requests. Next is action. Action is the specific API action for which we are granting or denying permission. Next is resource. Resource is the AWS resource that is affected by the action. We can specify the resources using an Amazon resource name or ARN in short, or using the star symbol to indicate that the statement applies to all the resources. And the last one is condition. Conditions are optional and they can be used to control when our policy is in effect, and it includes key and value pairs. Now let's see an example of a policy. The policy that you are seeing on your screen denies users permission to use all the Amazon EC2 API actions unless the region is EU Central 1. It uses the condition key AWS requested region, which is supported by all Amazon EC2 API actions. So that was all for this video. I hope you liked the video. Please subscribe the channel for more such videos. Thank you.